Today we're going to introduce supply. Again, supply will be part of the demand and supply curve. We introduced demand yesterday in class, and so today we're going to look at the second half of that graph, the supply curve. So let's look at what is supply first. Similar to demand, we're again going to look at the quantities of a particular good and the price and what the relationship is between. The difference with supply is instead of looking at it from the consumer side, now we're looking at it from the producer or the seller side. It's a little bit trickier in the beginning to try to think of it that way because most of us are used to being on the consumer side of the equation, but now you have to think like a seller when we're talking about supply. Same as with demand, a couple of keys is that they have to be willing and able to sell or to produce at the different prices. So again, we're looking at the different quantities that of a product or a good that sellers are willing and able to sell at different price points. Just like with demand, there's the law of demand. As price increased, the quantity demanded would fall. With the law of supply, we see a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And so as the price increases, the quantity producers make will also increase. Again, think of it like a seller. If the price goes up, you want to sell more of your product as the price is high. The inverse is true as well. As price drops, the quantity that you would make as a producer will fall. Again, the main driving force behind this is simply the incentive of profit. The higher the price, if your costs remain the same, and again we assume with this graph that outside factors are all held constant, the ceteris paribus principle. If the costs are held constant, the higher the price goes, the more your profit would be, thus giving you a greater incentive to produce more. We'll look at what the supply curve would look like. So now let's go ahead to direct relationship. We're going to use the same example that we used with demand, the market for cereal. And so you can see your supply schedule on the left hand side, and then you would go ahead and plot this out, and what you would see line, if you remember, that we have an downward sloping. A couple of things we want to label the supply curve at the top with a capital S, or you could write out supply like you see on the screen. Make sure your axes are labeled price and then quantity supplied. Since we're only looking at supply, when we add in the demand curve, it will just be quantity across the bottom. So now let's throw a scenario at you. Again, similar like we did with demand. What's going to keep this graph, what's going to be true if the graph is constant, and what happens when the curve will actually shift. So the scenario we have is, what if new companies start making cereal? So we're increasing the number of producers. We see, we'll update on the left hand side, and you'll see that the curve shifted to the right. Again, anytime on a graph you see a shift to the right, that's a sign that it has increased, whether we're working with demand or supply. And so what we see, one ways we can show the shift, we've got the arrow pointed to the right, and then we label the new line S2. That shows that the supply curve has increased. Now remember, if it would have just been a change in price, you would have just moved along the original curve. But because it's the change in supply, not just the change in quantity supplied, you can now look at the same price and see the difference in the two curves. It's a sign that it's a change in supply, not just a change in quantity supplied. Now let's look at now at another example and see what would happen. What would a decrease look like on the supply curve? Now we've got the example of what if a drought hit, and the drought destroys the corn and wheat crops. Obviously, things that would go into producing cereal. And so what we would get on the left, we're seeing now the new quantities supplied by the sellers, by the producers. A shift of the supply again, because it wasn't just price that changed. And this time we see a decrease of the supply curve. Again, we want to label that with an arrow to the left. Again, you want to label your new supply curve at the top of the curve as well. If you're taking notes and you drew them on the same graph, make sure you label it as S3 or S2 if you label the original change as S1, so you can draw the distinction between the two. And again, just to point out, notice that price didn't change, right? It was a shifter, an outside factor, that we allowed to shift the curve that caused a decrease in supply. To look at just briefly what these shifters are. So another scenario, what if cereal companies find a quicker way to make cereal? And that will lead us into what our 6 shifters of supply are. If you remember, for demand, our demand curve, we had 5 shifters. We had taste and preferences, number of consumers, price of related goods, both substitutes and complements, change in income, and future expectations of profit, of price. What we see with supply, now you're thinking of it from the seller's point of view, not the consumer's point of view. And we have 6 total shifters. A lot of these are going to look familiar to you as the ones of demand. The key is just to be able to think like a seller when you're looking at these shifters of supply. The first one, prices and availability of inputs or of resources. So if the prices of the materials you need to make your product go up, obviously that's going to cut into your profit, therefore decreasing your incentive. You would want to supply less. If your resources become cheaper, your profit would go up, therefore you'd want to supply more. So you would see an increase in supply. Number of sellers, very similar to the number of consumers from the demand shifters. If there are more sellers, obviously the supply will increase. If there are less sellers, obviously the supply will decrease. Technology is another one. It's pretty self-explanatory. If technology improves, it'll allow the supply to increase. If technology decreases, then it will decrease the overall supply. Number 4, the government actions, taxes, and subsidies. Again, you have to think of it from the seller's point of view, like a seller. Taxes would raise the cost of producing that item, and so therefore it's going to cut into their profit and decrease what their incentive would be as far as making profit. It would decrease their supply. Subsidies are payments by the government to offset cost. Essentially, it makes it cheaper to produce a certain product or a good. And so subsidy would increase the profitability of that product, therefore increasing the incentive and increasing supply. So almost every example you see, if it's a tax, where the tax is increasing, then it will shift supply to the left. It'll be a decrease. And almost every example you see of a subsidy will be an increase of supply. The one kind of caveat to that is sometimes they'll throw examples where they decrease taxes or they decrease subsidies, and so you have to be aware of those. Don't just always assume every time you see tax that it's a shift to the left, or every time you see subsidy it's a shift to the right. 5th one, opportunity cost of alternative production. Think of the substitute goods for the demand shifter. If you're a company and you can produce 2 products, you want to produce the one with the lowest opportunity cost. Again, you have to give up the least to produce that item. In a sense, it's the cheapest item you could produce. And so if the opportunity cost of the other item were to change, then that would affect your current production, what you're willing to supply of your current product. And then the last one, expectations of future profit. Same as our last shifter for demand, expectation of future price. If you expect your profit to increase a week from now, then what you supply today will decrease because you want to hold on to it and supply it a week from now when your profit would go up. Same is true as if you expect your profits to decrease a month from now, well then you want to supply as much as you can today so that when your profits decrease, you're not going to lose that extra revenue. So that is just a quick overview of supply. We've seen what the supply curves look like. It's an upward sloping line, and we did a quick rundown of your supply shifters. Tomorrow in class we will do a quick run through to kind of check to see how you do with these shifters, and then we'll put the graphs together.